Hello, and welcome back to Let's Get Lit. In today's episode, we're going to be going over Part 1, Chapter 3 of George Orwell's classic 1984. Join us as we go a little bit further in depth with the ministry and all sorts of other things that are starting to occur or things we're learning out with Winston. Shall we? This chapter starts off with Winston dreaming about his mother and father. He goes on to describe them and how his mother was tall, statuesque, and the silent woman with slow movements and magnificently fair hair. He remembered his father more vaguely, as dark and thin and always dressed in dark clothing. He also recalls the very thin soles of his shoes and that he wore spectacles. Winston thought that the two of them must evidently have been swallowed up in one of the first purges of the 50s. He then remembers his mother down beneath him with his young sister in her arms. He says he doesn't remember much about his sister, but just the fact that she was a baby with large eyes. As the dream continues, and Winston continues to describe it to the reader, we learn that Winston is a child in this dream, and that he's looking down at his mother and sister and his father sinking in the ship fathoms below the water. The dream makes him sad because he realizes that in this dream, his mother, father, and sister all died. So that way, he could stay alive. Or for the hope that he would stay alive. This saddens him because at that time period, his mother and father and sister all sacrificed the greatest gift for him, but he was too young and selfish to fully understand what was happening. He says that back in that time, families loved each other and stood together with each other on everything with no reason. But that would never happen today because of all the problems with the party and how everyone was so jealous and full of hatred towards one another, even family members. Suddenly, his dream shifts to him standing on a springy patch of turf. He describes everything around him and how this is a large field in the country, with a road full of trees and sunlight glittering all around the ground. He calls this place the Golden Country. As he's standing there on the patch of turf, the dark-headed girl that he mentioned from earlier comes across the field and with a single movement tore off all of her clothes and flung them disdainfully aside. He notes how white and perfect her body was, but it did not turn him on at all. He makes mention that this gesture was so graceful that it kind of seemed to put the entire thought of Big Brother and the party and the thought police all being swept aside into nothingness by this single movement. Winston then wakes up and the word Shakespeare is on his lips. The telescreen lets out a large, terrible hissing sound, and Winston wakes up and understands that the physical jerks are about to begin. The physical jerks were exercises that everyone was required to participate in. Winston had 3 minutes before they were to begin, and he begins going into a coughing fit in order to clear his lungs for the exercise. Winston gets up and goes to the telescreen, and in front of him a youngish woman, scrawny but muscular, dressed in a tunic and gym shoes, appears on the screen. They begin to do their exercises. As Winston is doing his exercise, he begins to think back about his childhood. He also mentions that people who were of the age of 40 or older, it was really hard for him to think back on their childhoods or an earlier time before Big Brother. This was due to the fact that everything that they had known had been wiped out. Everyone could have had these vivid memories, but wouldn't be able to prove its existence. One memory that Winston talks about is when he was a little kid, and the first big memory he had of an air raid, which appeared to take everyone by surprise. He says he thinks it happened with the atomic bomb falling on Colchester. He says he doesn't remember the raid itself, but he does cling to his father's hand, going down, down, down into some deep place under the earth on a spiral staircase. He says that his mom was behind them with her slow pace, holding something in her arms. He wasn't sure if it was his sister or some blankets because he wasn't sure if his sister was born at that exact moment. He mentions that when they finally get all the way down, he realizes that they are in a tube station. He mentions everybody being huddled together very tight, and some were sitting on metal bunks. Winston and his mother and father found themselves a spot on the floor near an old man and woman. The old man and woman were talking, and Winston could see, even though he was a small child, that this man had just experienced some great loss. He also mentions that this old man smelled very highly of gin, and that he wasn't even sure that the sweat was coming from the old man, but just gin being vaporized from his skin. He also wonders if the tears inside of this man's eyes were also gin. The only saying this man could say is that they shouldn't have trusted those buggers, but Winston wasn't sure which buggers they were referring to. Winston says that ever since then, war had literally been continuous throughout society. He says it may not have been exactly the same war throughout his whole life, but that war was pretty consistent in everyone's life from that point on. He also says that time was very weird and that no one really knew the sequence of order of history because it wasn't written down. Winston then tells the reader that what truly is scary about the party is that they were able to go back into the past and completely erase large events and histories. That surely was more terrifying than any other type of torture they could do. He also tells the reader that the party has a slogan, which is, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who who controls the present controls the past. Reality control was called doublethink in Newspeak. Winston goes on to explain doublethink and how essentially it's when you hold two different opinions and beliefs at the same time. How on the outside you agree to conform and believe in the logic that is presented to you from the party, but on the inside you hold your own idealistic beliefs, thoughts, and convictions, and never letting the two meld together. He also said it's kind of like whatever is necessary to forget, then you draw back on it into memories again at the moment when it's needed, and then promptly forget about it again, and so on and so forth. And that it was the ultimate subtlety because you had a surface layer and then you had its underneath layer, and that the surface layer would help protect you against the thought police. He said that in the end, that to even understand the word doublethink involves using doublethink. At that moment, the instructor had called them again, and they were going to bend over and touch their toes, and this kind of snaps Winston back into reality. He mentions how he hates this exercise, and it always causes him to cough again and again and go into coughing fits. He then goes on to tell the reader that because he's older, he remembers, or at least he believes he remembers, that the party wasn't always in control, that the party was known to spread lies, but people really couldn't find any convictions against these lies due to history being erased. One example he gives is that Big Brother said that they had always been in power since the 30s and 40s, to which Winston believes he knows that's not true, because he was a child in the 40s and 50s. There's no evidence to back him up. Another example he gives is that the party states that they're the ones who invented airplanes. Again, Winston knows this is not true, because when he was a kid, he remembers seeing airplanes in the sky everywhere before the party even came together. However, didn't have any evidence to back him up. Winston does say that once in his whole life, he had held in his hands unmistakable documentary proof of the falsification of a historical fact. But he doesn't complete his thought, because the instructor calls his name out of the telescreen. The instructor calls for Winston and tells him to bend lower and that she knows he can do better. She then says everyone should stand at ease and the whole squad should watch her. At this point, a hot sweat breaks out all over Winston's body, but he doesn't show dismay or resent. He states that even a little flicker of the eyes could give you away. The instructor demonstrates on how to touch your toes successfully without bending your knees. Winston watches her without any sort of disdain. She tells everyone that she has had 4 children and she's 39, and even she can touch her toes without bending her knees. She goes on to tell everyone that though they may not be fighting on the front lines, they can still keep fit. She says to remember our boys on the Malabar front and on the floating fortress. With this, Winston lunges down violently and is able to succeed in touching his toes with his knees unbent. This happens for the first time in several years. The instructor congratulates him. That is all of chapter 3. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please stay tuned as we go over chapter 4 of 1984. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and as always, stay lit.